Hi YouTube, welcome to my second massive tutorial, and in this tutorial we're going to be creating a pad sound. Um, Pads are one of the most important sounds, fundamental sounds that people create in using synthesizers, along with basses and leads, and drum sounds, etc. And a pad really is exactly what it says. It's a sound that pads the rest of the piece of music that you're working on. But a lot more than that, that they can also be very. They can either be very subtle sounds or very interesting progressive sounds. There can be a lot of complexity going on, and pads mean, I guess, a lot of things to a lot of people. Usually, when you go out and buy a new synthesizer, or at least this used to be the case in the 90s, um, or even earlier than that, quite often you go and find a preset on the synthesizer that would, and one of the very early presets that you would find early on in the bank would be some huge pad, and you'd hit this huge chord, and there'd be this enormous amount of complexity and vast sound booming out of the speakers immediately. And then it would probably take you about a year to figure out how they actually made that sound. Now, with virtual instruments like Massive, creating pads now is much easier than it was, say, on a DX7 or a Korg M1. And there are many more modulation opportunities that you get, or options that you get. Um, so quite often people now use VSTs to make these amazing pad sounds, and so we're going to make one today. We're going to keep it reasonably basic, but we're going to bring in a lot more than we looked at in the first tutorial. And I'm going to pretty much show you how to get there. So I'm going to use 3 oscillators. We're probably going to end up using 3 envelopes, 1 envelope for each oscillator. And we're going to use at least 2 or 3 LFOs. We'll see when we get through. We don't want to make it too complicated. And we're probably going to use both filters. So there's going to be a lot going on in this tutorial. So let's get going. So I think one of the first things that you need to decide is what kind of sound you're going for, and what kind of waveforms you're going to use. And the most classic waveforms to use obviously on old analog synthesizers would be square wave, sawtooth, sawtooth with pulse wave modulation, and maybe sine wave or triangle wave in the background to just kind of back it up and give it that bottom end oomph. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select those sounds right at the very start, and we're going to listen to them one by one, just using a very basic envelope, and then we're going to start shaping the sound pretty quickly so that this tutorial doesn't go on forever. So the first oscillator, I'm going to choose pulse wave modulation, which is basically a sawtooth and then a pulse wave, which technically all that really means is that you vary the gap between each saw, and you get quite an interesting sound by doing so. So the first one is going to be pulse to saw. I'm going to move that all the way over to pulse on the first oscillator. Second oscillator, I'm going to use a square wave. I'm just going to use the default one here and move that all the way over to square. And the third oscillator, I'm going to use a triangle. Keep this all the way over to triangle, and this is really just going to be to give a tiny bit of bottom end to the sound. So I'm actually going to switch that off for now, and this off for now. And we're just going to listen to this this pulse wave here, this pulse width, and just to really help us out, I've just created some chords and a little sequence so I can actually modulate these and still talk and play at the same time. Otherwise it'd be difficult to do that. So let's just hit play, and I'm going to change the pulse width, and you'll hear how the sound changes. So what's going on there is the width between the teeth on the saw. If you imagine that a saw wave looks something like, actually this doesn't, it looks something like this little squiggle here. What's happening is the gap between the wave modulation is getting narrower on each end of the scale. So it's more extreme at each end of the scale, but you get that kind of classic mid-70s synthesizer sound, which I think is pretty cool. So that's the first sound that we're going to use. Second sound we're going to use is a square wave. Square waves are really good at giving you the middle meat of the sound that you're looking for. So I'm just going to play this. It's not that interesting, so I'm not going to play it for too long. But we're going to do something with that later on. We're going to add some resonance and some filter to that, and just take it down a tone. The dominant sound is going to be the pulse wave. And then finally, just to give it some lower end oomph, we're going to use a triangle wave, which sounds like a cross between a square wave and a sawtooth wave, and that's because it is, and it's kind of like a sine wave that you can modulate. You can't really modulate a sine wave, or you can, but it's complicated, and we'll see how that sounds. So again, not really a whole lot going on there. So they're the three sounds that we're going to use, and we're going to work on the oscillator 1 piece of this first, just to add a little bit of movement. Now, one of the things with pads that you can do, you can either have, the way that I like to approach it is that you'll have one sound that's fairly constant in its movement, and pretty much the main part of the pad, and then you have some other sounds that kind of come in and go out, and make it more interesting, especially if you hold the notes for a really long time. So you don't really get bored with the tone of the note, because there's other things going on that are interesting. So let's deal with the first part of this. We're going to send this first pulse wave into filter 1. So I'm going to move this all the way up to filter 1. We're not going to do too much with filter 1 right now, but I'm going to put in a low-pass filter. There's 4-pole and 2-pole, and the difference is quite subtle, but 4-pole is the most common use, and we'll go into the difference at some later stage. And I'm just going to set this with no resonance and the full cut-off filter here. And the first thing that I really want to do is just add some depth or variation to the sound of the pulse wave, as well as doing something a bit more interesting with the overall envelope of the sound. So I'm going to do both of those pretty much at the same time. So let's take a look at the envelope. The overall sound, so all three oscillators are going to be influenced by the primary envelope. We're going to use envelopes 1 and 2 to do something a bit more interesting with oscillators 2 and 3. But the overall sound, I'm just going to modulate. And pads sound best when, the most basic pads, the fundamentals of a pad sounds best when the attack is a little lower, and the release is a little longer. We don't really have to do anything in the middle, but I'm going to just bring down the level ever so slightly after the initial attack, and immediately we'll hear a difference in the sound. So if I just hit my sequence again. So still not that interesting, but bear with me. But at least now we have a little bit of a smoother attack, and we'll work on that later on. But what I want to do is I want to add some dynamics to this sound. So as I showed at the start, we're going to really modulate this pulse width here, and we're going to do it quite subtly. It's one of the things I think people don't do very well when they're making a pad sound, is that sometimes they just do really extreme modulation, just to get the effect across. But that's not something that I'm going to do right here. So let's bring in this LFO, and what I'm doing is I'm actually telling LFO5 to modulate this pulse width key here, and I'm going to just by clicking on this and moving it up and down, I can tell it how much to modulate it by. So let's just see what effect that has. So what I was doing there is I was just listening in to see whether it's synchronizing with the tempo would make it sound better. It made it sound a little artificial. Sometimes with LFOs, you want to have the rate being free of the tempo, so it sounds a little more natural. Otherwise, it just sounds too much like a computer made it. But now we have a little bit of pulse width going on, so there's a little bit of dynamic in the sound. And we've got a free format LFO. It's just a nice wave, and it just sounds a little bit more interesting than it did initially. Okay, but it's still a little bit bland. So maybe what we could do is we could just add a little bit of filter cutoff and make it a little bit more subtle. So I'm going to cut the filter off, add a little bit of resonance, and just try and make this. I'm going to fiddle around with the pulse width just a little bit more, see if we can get a little bit more dynamics in this. So you can hear that it's still a little bit flat and dead. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a second modulation to the sound. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to modulate the cutoff filter with another envelope. So I'm going to choose envelope 3 here. And what I'm going to do is tell envelope 3 to modulate this cutoff. And what I'm doing now is I need to set the cutoff somewhere where I want it to start, and then the envelope will basically increase and decrease the cutoff according to the shape of the envelope. Now, so let's just see exactly how this sounds right now. It probably won't make any difference. So you can hear our pulse width there is working a little bit. Actually sounds like that was doing that negatively. Let me try that again. Yeah. So what that's doing now is as I release the key, the cutoff is moving from the start position to the end position. Now what this is doing is as soon as I release the key, the cutoff is happening almost immediately. If I release that, turn the release up a little bit more, but you can hear now that the cutoff is following this sign, this wave here. Now it's a little bit confusing as to whether or not you have positive or negative cutoff and where your start and end points are. Sometimes I still get confused myself, but basically what's going on here is the cutoff is following this envelope, so it's going from the lowest point to the highest point initially, and it's fading off slightly, and then as I release the key, it's cutting off following this release. If this envelope is more subtle than this envelope, it's a bit difficult to explain, but basically if the tail here is very, very long and the tail here is very, very short, you won't get the full benefit of that. But that might be the effect that you actually want. But the way that these two envelopes interact will shape your sound. So I'm going to increase the attack a little bit here, and just increase the release here just a little bit longer. So the sound, the attack here will be slower than the attack here, which means that the subtleness of this will be lost a little bit, but that's actually what I want. So let's listen to that. Okay, so I'm just going to raise that level a little bit just to make that a little bit more subtle, and lengthen the decay just slightly. Okay, so now we have a sound that's a little bit more interesting. We just play that sequence again. I'm not going to let the cutoff go all the way to, all the way to the top end, because I don't want it to open right up. Let's just see what effect that makes. So there we go. So let's leave that for now. Oscillator 1, it's okay. It's not that amazing, but it's just the kind of thing you probably would have got out of an early synthesizer 30 years ago, just by playing around with the filter and the envelopes. Let's bring in Oscillator 2 to try and make this a little bit more interesting. So Oscillator 2 is now going to follow this exact same envelope 4. But it isn't going to be affected by envelope 3 because it isn't, actually it is, because it's going through filter 1 as well. I'm going to move this all the way to filter 2, so let's try that again. Okay, so now what I'm saying is, actually something I forgot is this this dial here, if you're using both filters, really needs to be in the middle, as does this one. I'm going to go into what this really means later on, and this needs to be brought all the way up. I think I mentioned this in the first tutorial, but sorry if you're seeing this for the first time. These dials are very confusing in the way that they interact with one another, and we need to look at the routing. I'll probably dedicate a tutorial to that. But if in doubt, these sliders are how much impact the filter has on the oscillator that's routed to it, and these two sliders are basically the mix between both the oscillators and the filters, and if you put them both in the middle, you'll get the best mix. They both appear to be doing the same thing, but they're actually not. It's a subtle difference. One's the input, one's the output of the filters. But anyway, put those in the middle, have these right up, as you're following along with this tutorial. Oscillator 2 is going to go to filter 2, oscillator 1 is going to filter 1. So, sorry, I'm just backing up ever so slightly. So what I want here is I want the square wave also to have some dynamics, but I'm going to apply an LFO to the filter rather than to a pulse width modulation, and just allow it to follow along with what's going on with the first filter. And this is really to give a little bit more depth to the sound. But before I do that, one of the very common things that you can do is detune the oscillators. Now, even if the oscillators are exactly the same waveform, and in fact, especially if they're exactly the same waveform, detuning the oscillators from one another is a really powerful thing to give you much more width and fatness, as they call it, to the sound. So I'm just going to show you, I'm going to detune these ever so slightly, but you'll see it makes a huge difference. So I don't know if you heard that right away, but that actually makes an enormous difference to the width of the sound. So what I'm going to do now is oscillate this filter 2. So I'm just going to switch this first oscillator off so you can really hear this in isolation. And this is something that we did in tutorial 1, so it should be very, very easy for you to follow along. And we're going to make this, I'm going to make it just a sine wave. I'm going to bring in LFO 6. We're going to keep this as a free rate as well. If you remember, LFO 1 was free. LFO 2 we're going to keep free as well. So they might be slightly out of sync, which will make the sound even more interesting. But we're going to make them more or less the same setting. I'm just going to make it slightly slower. So I'm just going to play around with this just for a couple of seconds, and you can listen along. So now you can hear that that sounds very quite unique on its own. When we bring in back in oscillator 1, it gives a kind of an organic sound in the background. It's kind of interesting. Now, what we could do to make it maybe a little bit more interesting, I'm finding that the frequencies are a little bit too low and they're interfering with each other. So we can actually change this filter to a high pass filter. And bring this. I need to bring this down, and take out some of those lower tones on the square wave. So let's just see how that sounds. Very different sound according to your tastes. You may or may not like that. I'm actually not really liking the way that this pad's going. It's a little bit harsh. Probably taking this into a slightly wrong direction. But I think the functionality is probably more important. Understanding the functionality is more important than liking the sound here. So yeah, I'm actually going to change that back to a low pass. I'm going to bring this up a little bit just to keep the higher tones of the square wave there. I'm just going to bring the amp down a little bit so keep it more. So yeah, I think that's a little bit more interesting. So now oscillator 3 is bringing in this this triangle wave, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually drop this an octave. Now I've pulled the amp right down, dropped this an octave, but you can hear immediately this adds a huge amount of depth and a bit of a floor to the sound. So I'm going to turn it on and off, and you can hear what's going on. So you can hear that makes a huge amount of difference. Now I'm actually allowing this to go through both filter 1 and filter 2. In some ways it might be more interesting if we completely bypass that, but just for the time being, to avoid this getting very complicated, I'm going to leave that exactly as it is. So that's a basic sound, so I'm just going to play it freeform. You can hear that that's kind of cool. Now, where we can really add something just a little bit more ethereal, if that's even really a word, is just by adding a little bit of white noise at the end, or after quite a long chord press. This is one of the things I used to love about some of the old, Jean-Michel Jarre and Vangelis chords. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the noise generator. It's already actually switched on, but there's nothing on the amp. I'm just going to bring this up a little bit, and I'm going to take everything off. And what I'm going to try and do is just sweep the noise so it kind of makes that sound. But I want that to come in quite late in the chord. So how do I do that? Well, let's go to envelope. Actually, is envelope 1 being used for anything? No, we've got envelope 3 here. Let's use envelope 1. And I bring envelope 1 down to the amp here for the white noise. We've got different types of noise here. It's completely crazy the amount of options you have. And let's just play that sequence. Okay, so it's basically following the LFO that's on this cutoff filter, but we can kind of override that a little bit just by actually I don't know if we can override it because we only have two filters, but what we can do is we can have this sweep down a little bit just using the envelope. So using envelope 1 here, what I'm going to do is now that comes in very slowly, but if you imagine that the sound is already at a peak by the time this comes in, if we delay this, right, what you'll hear is now it's going to, actually it's not delayed so much, now it's going to sound much more like it's just popping in. Not quite enough there. So if I need to basically move this beyond this point, which it is now, so let's try that. Still not quite getting the effect that I want. So not sure quite why that's not working the way I'm expecting it to. Okay, we're kind of getting there. What I really want to happen is for this to delay long enough that this envelope comes in and is at the full width, is at full volume by the time this one kicks in. But I'm not quite getting it to be as dramatic as I want it to be. But that's okay. It might be because this filter cutoff's impacting this. But what I then want to do is bring this level right down here, and this decay very, very subtle. So I just want it to slowly fade to nothing. Well, I'm a little bit confused as to why that's not. Oh. Alright, so if you've been watching this, pulling your hair out, I know exactly why that's not working. So I didn't actually tell this modulation how much to affect this amp. It's very funny, or kind of not that funny. So let's try and make this as... let's try that again. Okay, so now you hear that there's a delay when I hit the key. I'm going to put the microphone next to the key so you can hear. That was the effect I was looking for. And then I'm going to increase the release here so you can hear it a little bit better. Now what that allows you to do is allows you to have this envelope act quite independently of the first envelope, but it will just start much later. So when you bring in the other sounds, let's just bring them in, you'll hear the noise pop in a little while after the chord has started. So let's try that. It's quite subtle, and you can make it more dramatic by adding more delay. The problem is it's not decaying fast enough, so I'm going to increase the decay. So I just want it to go a little bit too much there. Experiment with this a little bit. It kind of sounds like something is just kind of releasing something. I didn't really think about this before I did the tutorial, but so it's not the most amazing sound in the world, but it is, you get the idea that basically after a short amount of time you can bring in another sound that follows its own envelope, and that kind of comes in later in your sound. We could make this a little bit more more interesting. I mean, if we just slowed that attack down quite a lot, and still bring it right down, this would actually now be a lot more subtle. I should add a little bit of color to that as well. So I think that's a little bit more interesting. But you get the idea. One of the limitations is the two filters. I think that once you start using this, you start wishing that maybe you had another filter and you could filter this completely independently. But what you can do is you could modulate this color. This actually makes a lot of difference to the sound. So if I just press, other things I could do is I could just drop in a completely independent LFO to that, make sure that I'm modulating it appropriately in both directions. Get rid of that restart and okay, I think that's enough. That is how you build up pads. I'm not sure if I'm very happy with the result. I probably wouldn't use this patch, but I think you get the idea that that having the ability to use multiple oscillators that are modulated in slightly different ways, you can get a lot of movement in a patch sound, in a pad sound, beg your pardon, for a particular patch, and you can take it from there. I may try and do this again with a slightly more thought out sound. But anyway, thanks for watching. Please leave some feedback. Thank you.